It was Friday morning. I got to school early and went to my locker to grab my books. The halls were mostly empty since it was still pretty early. I saw a few of my friends and waved hello as I headed to class. My first few classes went by uneventfully. I took notes and tried to pay attention, but my mind started drifting as it often does. I found myself staring out the window, watching the sunlight dance through the trees. It was during third period English when it happened. We were quietly reading an excerpt from our latest novel study when all of a sudden an announcement came over the PA system. Attention students and staff. We are now in full lockdown. This is not a drill. Immediately lock and barricade all doors and windows and move to a corner away from sight. My classmates and I all froze, unsure if we had heard correctly. Our teacher, Ms. Brown, leapt up and rushed to lock the classroom door. "You heard the announcement. Lock down positions, everyone, now," she ordered. We all scrambled to push desks against the door and huddled into the farthest corner. Alice and Amber, who had been seated near the windows, hurried to close the blinds. We sat there huddled silently, listening for any sounds from the hallway. All we could hear was our own breathing echoing in the darkened classroom. Someone sniffled quietly, trying to hold back tears. Ms. Brown paced back and forth, glancing anxiously at the barricaded door. After 15 agonizing minutes, we heard noises coming from right outside the hall. They started as soft clicks and shuffles, gradually getting louder and more frantic. It sounded like someone was checking each door, rattling handles and pushing on doors. We held our breath, willing whoever it was to keep going and leave us alone. The noises got closer and closer until they were right outside our door. We could hear muffled voices on the other side, though we couldn't make out what they were saying. There was a loud thud as something heavy hit the door. Then another. They were trying to break in. Ms. Brown looked around at us with an expression of determination. She told us that no matter what happens, we should stay absolutely silent and not make a sound. We nodded, wide-eyed with fear. There was another series of loud thuds as the intruders slammed against the barricaded door again and again. We could hear the desks scraping across the floor each time. Finally, with a deafening crash, the door burst open. Shards of wood flew across the room as the door splintered. 3 people clad all in black strode into the room holding large guns. They swept the room quickly before focusing on Ms. Brown. One of them told her to get up. Ms. Brown stood slowly, her hands raised in submission. 2 of the intruders hauled her out of the room while the third kept watch over us. He paced around the classroom, glaring at us huddled in the corner. After what felt like ages, the 2 others returned and whispered something to the third. With a snarl, he turned and they all abruptly left the room, slamming the remains of the door closed. We waited several more minutes, listening intently before tentatively leaving our corner. Alice and Amber replaced the broken door with more desks and bookshelves, while the rest of us tried to process what had just happened. Where was Ms. Brown? Who were the armed intruders? Were we still in danger? About half an hour later, the intercom crackled to life again. "The school is all clear. Lockdown has been lifted. Students, please report directly to the gymnasium." We all looked at each other in bewilderment, but followed instructions to head to the gym. As we walked through the halls, we saw remnants of chaos everywhere. Shattered glass, overturned furniture, and bullet holes riddled the walls. Teachers guided us hurriedly past certain corridors, their eyes shifting around warily. I spotted a streak of red along one wall that looked ominously like blood. The gym was in pandemonium, packed with unharmed students from other classes. We found seats on the bleachers, listening as law enforcement and school officials explained the situation. Apparently, 3 armed individuals had broken into the school seeking a student for unknown reasons. In the commotion, they had shot and killed 2 students and taken a teacher hostage. Luckily, police had arrived promptly before further violence ensued. The intruders were now in custody, but the school remained an active crime scene. I sat in shock, overwhelmed with emotions. 2 of my fellow students were dead and Ms. Brown was still missing. The lockdown was over, but the fear remained. I knew our lives had been changed permanently by the traumatic events of the day. The innocence and safety we had always associated with school was shattered. We were eventually reunited tearfully with our families. Counselors were brought in, and we were offered time away from school to cope and process. When we finally returned several days later, new security measures were in place. Armed guards roamed the hallways and grief counseling rooms had been set up. Our lives would never be the same. Normal had been redefined. As I reflect back now on that horrific day, I still get chills remembering the terror I felt. Though physically unharmed, emotionally I carry scars from living through that traumatic school lockdown. The sounds of those violent intruders at our barricaded door will haunt me forever. I wonder what would have happened had they gotten inside and how close we came to danger. It's unsettling to think about. I'm grateful no more innocent lives were lost and that the assailants were caught. But I'll never forget the day violence shattered our small-town innocence and left an indelible mark of fear and trauma on us all. It was just another normal Monday morning at school. I got to class a little early and was chatting with my friends before the bell rang. Our teacher, Mrs. Davis, came in right as the bell went off, and everyone scrambled to their seats and she started taking attendance as usual. About halfway through the list, we heard the lockdown alarm. That long, droning buzz that every student knows means danger. Mrs. Davis jumped up and rushed to lock the classroom door and turn out the lights. "Lockdown," she shouted. "This is not a drill. Get away from the door and windows and be silent." We all exchanged panicked glances but did as we were told, huddling on the floor in the far corner. A few kids were crying softly. I pulled my phone out to text my mom that I loved her just in case. Mrs. Davis quickly came around and made us all put our phones away, hissing at us to be quiet. The intercom crackled to life. "This is Principal Clark. The school is now in full lockdown. This is not a drill. Teachers, keep your students quiet and away from any points of entry. Do not open your door until given the all-clear by police." His voice sounded shaky, which terrified me even more. Our principal was always calm and collected. The classroom was dead silent now except for muffled sobs. We could hear doors slamming and shouts from down the hall as other classes went into lockdown. I strained my ears but couldn't make out any different sounds that might give us a clue as to what was happening. After what felt like forever, we finally heard sirens approaching. Police must be arriving, I thought. Mrs. Davis looked relieved but still had us remain huddled in the corner. Suddenly, loud pops rang out from the hallway outside, unmistakably gunshots. Several kids shrieked in fear before Mrs. Davis frantically shushed them. More gunshots followed, seeming to get closer. Heavy boots stomped right outside our door and we could hear voices shouting. Mrs. Davis whimpered, clearly terrified. The doorknob rattled violently as someone tried to get in. We all held our breath, paralyzed with fear. After a few agonizing seconds of pulling, the intruder seemed to give up and move on. A few muffled gunshots sounded further away, and then there was silence. No one dared move a muscle. The minutes crawled by. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the intercom crackled back to life. "The threat has been neutralized. I repeat, the threat has been neutralized. The lockdown is now over. Police will be coming door to door." Mrs. Davis leapt up and turned on the lights, sinking into her chair in relief. We were all still huddled on the floor, looking around at each other in shock. The classroom door opened and 2 police officers entered, confirming the lockdown was over. We were escorted outside where panicked parents were waiting behind police tape. I found my mom and just hugged her tight, both of us crying in relief. We later learned that a troubled former student had entered the school with a gun, intent on harming certain students and teachers. 2 students were injured, but thankfully no one was killed. The rest of that day was a blur. We were sent home early and I know none of us got any sleep that night, haunted by the sounds of gunshots and boots stomping outside our door. When we returned to school the next day, we were met with counselors and a very shaken staff. Our classroom had 2 empty seats where the injured students used to be. I still get anxious sometimes when I hear a door slam or boots on a hard floor. That day changed all of us, students, teachers, and the community. We learned that lockdowns are never just drills. Real danger could lurk behind any door and we must be ready to face fear and protect each other. I'm just grateful my classmates and I survived to tell the tale. It was just another normal Wednesday morning at Jefferson High School. As an assistant teacher, I arrived early to help set up the classrooms and organize materials for the day's lessons. The hallways were quiet and empty as I unlocked my classroom door and turned on the lights, and booted up my computer to review the schedule. Around 7:15 a.m., students started filtering in. I greeted them cheerfully as they took their seats and chatted with friends. The morning bell rang at precisely 7:30, signaling the official start of the school day. As first period began, I circulated around the room, assisting students who had questions about the assignment. So far, so typical. About halfway through the class, the fire alarm suddenly started blaring. The kids looked around in confusion but followed the standard drill procedures, lining up calmly to exit the building. I grabbed my roster and led my students outside to the evacuation zone, where we were instructed to wait for the all-clear signal. Teachers from other classes streamed out with their students, gathering in orderly lines on the lawn. After 10 minutes or so, the alarm was still blaring, but no one had given us any updates. The students were starting to get restless. I was just about to ask my teacher colleague if she knew what was happening when we heard shouts coming from inside the school. There was some kind of commotion near the front entrance. Before we could react, the front doors burst open and a masked gunman stormed out, wildly waving a pistol. Students began screaming and running in all directions. "Get down!" I yelled, my heart lurching in terror. The gunman fired 2 shots in the air, which panicked the students further. My mind raced, thinking only of how to protect my students. As the gunman approached our area, I quickly instructed my students to run to the back of the school and get as far away as possible. Just as they fled the scene, I heard 3 loud bangs. The gunman had opened fire on a security guard who had emerged from the front office. I saw the guard clutch his arm and collapse to the ground. Instinctively, I ran to the fallen guard to give first aid. As I applied pressure to his wound, I noticed our assistant principal, Ms. Walters, creeping up behind the shooter. Before he saw her coming, she whacked him from behind with a fire extinguisher, knocking him to the ground. "Grab his gun!" Ms. Walters yelled to me. Hands shaking, I pried the pistol from his grip while Ms. Walters held him down. Soon sirens were blaring as police swarmed the area. The gunman was taken into custody, and the wounded security guard was rushed to the hospital. The police did a thorough sweep of the building and escorted us back inside once it was secured. Though rattled, all students and staff were confirmed safe. We were sent home for the day as investigators tried to determine a motive for the shooter. I was in total shock as I drove myself home that morning. While it was over quickly, the violence had shaken me to my core. By some miracle, the security guard would make a full recovery, sustaining only a minor arm injury. But the sad truth remained. Our innocent school community had been violated by a senseless act of aggression. In the aftermath, counselors were made available to all students and staff. Additional security measures were put in place, though of course nothing could guarantee total safety. As teachers, we were heartbroken at being unable to shield our kids from such cruelty in the world. But we found some comfort in how we united to care for one another when it mattered most. While I'll never forget the terror of that day, I'm choosing not to let it haunt me. I refuse to give that gunman any more power over our lives. I'm simply grateful we made it through together, and that from tragedy, new strength was born in our community. No matter what darkness we encounter, there is always light ahead if we walk hand in hand.